Cora. I'm one of 8 of the EDA crew. I'm the bakery top at Winnipeg's local queer, anti-racist, decolonial sourdough bakery. Alright, today we are talking about making sourdough bread for the home baker. The first most important step of any sourdough baking that you're going to do is your sourdough starter. So this is a bucket full of wild yeast. It's flour and water that's fermenting. Wild yeast exists all around us. It's in the air, it's on the surfaces, it's on our skin, and there's a lot of yeast that hangs out on flour. So when you take flour and you mix it with water, there's enzymes in the flour that break down into a natural sugar. Yeast feeds off of sugar, so it eats the sugar and it becomes alive. And then all you have to do is continue to feed your starter with more flour and water in order to create more sugar, and the starter stays alive. Feeding your starter is, ideally it's a daily process, so once every 24 hours. You want to mix your starter with your hand. That's because you'll be able to feel when the flour is all mixed in. Another reason why you use your hands to feed the starter is that there's good bacteria on your hands. Of course, you always want to use clean hands, but even when your hands are clean, there's good bacteria hanging out on your hands. And as you get to know your starter, which is a living being, your body and your starter will begin to merge, and the bacteria on your hands will match the bacteria in your starter. Okay, now we're going to talk about mixing your dough. First off, the bread that we're making today is made with just flour, water, and sea salt, so it's very basic ingredients. When you're mixing your dough, you start off with water in your bowl. Okay, then you have pre-ferment, which is going to be on your recipe. There's a recipe for a pre-ferment. It's very similar to a starter, and you can follow the recipe in order to make a pre-ferment, or you can choose just to use starter. It's totally fine. This is your yeast right here. So we're going to add our yeast to our water. And then flour. The recipe that is included here is 80% white flour, 20% whole wheat. So that's a ratio you can play with, but stick with wheat while you're learning how to make bread, because it's easier. It's the easiest flour to use. At this point, we haven't added any salt yet. And we're going to let this dough rest for about half an hour before we mix the salt into the dough. Okay, so salt time. You can just sprinkle your salt right on top of your dough. And then I like to put a splash of water on top of the salt and sort of rub it into the dough. And then again, I'm being rough with this dough. I'm squeezing it in between my fingers because I want to make sure that all of the salt is totally mixed in, because nobody wants salt clumps in their bread. So there it is. The salt is totally mixed in, and that's my complete dough. If you want to add other things to your dough to make other kinds of bread, such as raisins or seeds or nuts or anything, you would mix it in with the salt. Okay, after your salt is mixed into the dough, then your dough is complete as it is. You're going to start to be gentle with the dough, and the dough will rise. So it rises for an extended period of time, roughly 4 hours. Throughout this process, you're going to be checking in on your dough every half hour. So for the span of 4 hours, you're checking in on the dough every half hour. And the first thing that you do when you're checking on your dough is you just look at it. So you want to look at it and check for signs of fermentation. So the first thing that I see are bubbles on the surface. There's some really big ones, and then I can see there's a lot of smaller bubbles right under the surface of the dough. And I can also see that my dough has risen, and so that's another sign of fermentation. So those are 2 good things. I look, I see it's fermenting, that's great. The next thing that I'm going to do is touch the dough. So whenever you're handling dough, using wet hands will make it stick to your hands less. So now I'm going to check for gluten development. So I'm doing what's called a window pane test. You can do it just like that, or you can grab a ball of dough and you're stretching it, trying to get a window pane so you can sort of see light through it. And it is tearing a little bit here. What we're going for is you be able to stretch it out so you have a nice thin window pane without much tearing. So I can tell this gluten is a little bit weak, but it's fine because I can see light through it and it's not tearing terribly. And then the third thing that you do with your dough every half hour is called a stretch and fold. So you want to take the dough from every side of your container, stretch it and fold it. So this is what's developing gluten throughout the rising process. So while I'm stretching it, I'm pulling it as far as it'll go, but I'm not pulling it farther than that because I don't want any tearing. And then I will put the lid back on my container and then come back and do the same thing in half an hour. And then after about 4 hours, the dough should be ready to go. After your dough has risen for 4 hours, the gluten is developed nicely and you have a nice properly fermented dough, then it's time to shape your bread. So use enough flour so that you're not sticking, but no more than that. And then the pre-shape is you're using your tool, you're pushing your dough up, turning it, and pulling it back toward you. So what you're doing is you're keeping the top of the dough on the top and the bottom is on the bottom, and you're pulling the sides around and tucking the seams underneath. So I'm pushing my dough up, turning it, and pulling it back. And generally it doesn't take too many motions in order to get a nice round shape. You want nice surface tension, so if you poke at it, it bounces back at you. If there's air bubbles, there's quite a bit of an air bubble here, so I'll kind of disperse it, but don't worry too much about it. It's a good sign, it means it's fermented. So this is the first step of shaping. And then at this point, you're gonna let it, you can cover it with a towel on your counter and let it rest for a half hour. So when you're entering your second shaping, the first step is to flip your dough upside down. And then you are going to sort of relax the dough into a rectangle. And you're taking the bottom two corners, folding them up. You don't want to push down on the dough because that deflates all of the fermentation that has just happened. You're just pressing to seal. And then you take the top corners, fold them down. So you're folding, you're making an envelope basically. Then you turn it, take the bottom corners, fold it up, and again, top, down. And that's your shaped loaf. Then you can choose just to flour the basket, or you can use a tea towel, put that in the basket, and then flour that. And then you take your loaf. So right now the loaf, I did my folds and I've placed it upright onto the counter so all of the seams are underneath it. This is the top of the loaf. So I want to take the top of the loaf and put it upside down in the basket so that the seams are facing me, and then you swaddle up your baby and you pop it in the fridge. So the bread stays in the fridge overnight, and then the next morning you take it out of the fridge. You have a baking sheet prepared with parchment paper, and then you're going to gently transfer your dough onto the baking sheet. So now we have this face up again. Before you pop the dough into the oven, you're going to want to score it. So a simple cut is just like that. And then you're going to throw it into your oven, preheated to 450 degrees, and bake it for about a half hour. And you're baking it until the bottom is hollow when you knock on it, and the crust will be darker than you expect it to be. It'll soften as it cools, and then you eat your bread. And that's a wrap on sourdough home bacon.